Grover Furr is, to put it simply, an extremely pro-USSR historian that rightfully has been criticized for making many lambastic and over-the-top statements in defense of the Soviet Union. However, these same leftists that I see criticize Grover Furr for his lack of credentials and silly statements rarely seem to do anything similar when it comes to the severe lack of credentials and silly statements that anti-USSR historians make, to the point that it makes Grover Furr look almost like Nostradamus in comparison in terms of quality as a historian. Ultimately, I figure if people can criticize Grover Furr's past and his statements, however fair their critiques are or not, and they are often fair, it could only be fair to hold anti-Soviet historians to the same standards that we hold pro-Soviet historians to. It would only be fair to critically examine the pasts and statements of anti-USSR historians as well, right? Of course, the more you do, the more stunning it becomes that so many so-called socialists just uncritically parrot whatever these people have said, even though many of them have so publicly and openly right-wing affiliations and beliefs. For example, most of the so-called original generation of USSR historians and some of the most influential writers on the Soviet Union, whose claims are still believed uncritically to this day, people like Robert Conquest, Robert Tucker, Walter Laqueur, Hannah Arendt, and Richard Pipes, were not just anti-communists, but very open right-wingers. Robert Conquest, the single most famous and influential of the original generation of historians of the USSR, was given the Presidential Medal of Freedom by Ronald Reagan, endorsed the anti-communist Contras, and called himself a Cold Warrior, or someone who was in favor of the West during the Cold War. He also famously said, as Getty writes, that rumor and hearsay was perfectly acceptable evidence to use in your history. Getty quotes him saying, "Truth can thus only percolate in the form of hearsay." And further, quote, "On political matters basically the best, though not infallible, source is rumor," unquote. Getty goes on to write that he believes that the best way to check rumors is to compare them with other rumors, a dubious procedure given the fact that anti-Soviet émigrés read each other's works. Conquest, of course, also worked with the CIA, and he was far from the only one either. As Harvey Silverglate writes, John Kavanagh, then director of the Institute for Policy Studies, wrote in an article published in 1980 that throughout the 1960s and possibly beyond, at least 5 Princeton professors worked secretly as high-level consultants for the CIA, a fact discovered from the personal papers of former CIA director and Princeton alumnus Allen W. Dulles. Dulles' papers indicated that Princeton was far from alone among American universities in providing academic consultation to American intelligence specialists, and not all of these activities were even kept secret. Silverglate goes on to write, one of the Princeton professors, renowned Russian scholar James Hadley Billington, later the Librarian of Congress, admitted in 1968 to the undergraduate newspaper, the Daily Princetonian, that he consulted for the CIA Office of National Estimates 2 or 3 times a year. Fellow Princeton historian, and another anti-USSR scholar, Cyril Black, who in 1976 had denied to the campus newspaper that he had ever been in the CIA's employ, admitted to Kavanagh in 1980, when Kavanagh gained access to the Dulles papers and the truth had emerged, that he had been a paid consultant. "Nobody ever asked me if I was a consultant," Black explained, thus giving himself the leeway to deny the rumors that he was an employee. The prominent Soviet historian Richard Pipes also worked with the CIA and was an advisor to Ronald Reagan. The historian Robert Tucker worked for the Rand Corporation, a fixture of U.S. foreign policy decision-making. Walter Laqueur worked with CIA-funded institutions and was a rabid Zionist. Hannah Arendt, the original deviser of the idea of the totalitarian model, so-called, was an incredibly overt pro-colonialist, racist, and Nazi sympathizer. Many of today's Soviet historians who still hold to the original generation's interpretations of the USSR as a totalitarian and hyper-oppressive state aren't much less compromised. David Satter, for example, was a senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute, an organization that advocates for regime change on behalf of the United States, and where he wrote multiple anti-Soviet works. But perhaps no modern originalist Soviet historian is more hilariously compromised, more openly untrustworthy than the historian Anne Applebaum. Applebaum is the author of very popular works like The Gulag, easily findable at your local Barnes & Noble. Among other things, Anne Applebaum worked at the American Enterprise Institute, a conservative think tank, and is a member of the National Endowment for Democracy, which is funded by the CIA for the express purpose of American regime change. Anne Applebaum is even faculty of the Johns Hopkins Center for International Studies, which is also home to the Kissinger Center, named, of course, after Secretary of State Henry Kissinger. Other historians of the USSR who work for the Henry Kissinger Center include Sergei Radchenko, who is extremely anti-USSR, and former members of the Henry Kissinger Center include Derek Chollet, Undersecretary to the United States Secretary of State, Kathleen Hicks, current Deputy Secretary of State, and John Lipsky, Deputy Director of the IMF and former JP Morgan executive. Applebaum is also on the Global Disinformation Index's advisory panel. That's right. A right-wing libertarian who peddles disinformation for a living is also part of an organization that supposedly fights disinformation. Mind you, she's not just any historian. She is one of the most influential modern historians of the USSR. She's the only person, to my knowledge, at the Barnes & Noble Russian history book section that has not one but 2 books on the USSR on display. Then there are the more liberal originalist historians, but who have not much less embarrassing resumes, people like Timothy Snyder, arguably the most famous modern historian of the USSR, in no small part thanks to his revival of the right-wing myth that the Nazis and the Soviets were equals of sorts. Snyder serves on the Council on Foreign Relations, a think tank that created the idea of containment against communists during the Cold War, or, in other words, the excuse America used to invade, coup and destroy countless countries that in any way tried to stand up to American imperialism, and which has also served host to numerous CIA directors, secretaries of state, and CEOs. But that's not all. What about the famous Dmitry Volkogonov, who was an advisor to Boris Yeltsin who single-handedly destroyed Russia? Or what about another one of the most respected liberal historians of the USSR today, the Rothschild-related Simon Montefiore, who participated in the anti-Semitism smear campaign against Jeremy Corbyn? One of Simon's most famous contributions to Soviet historiography is his accusation that Stalin slept with a 14-year-old girl, and while this may or may not be true, I haven't looked into the claim too deeply, given that Stalin is not of as much interest for me to defend as he used to be, but Montefiore himself also happens to be in Espetine's Black Book, and is also known for making heavily exaggerated claims about the sex lives of his subjects in other works, such as The Russians in Moscow. Then there's the well-respected Orlando Figes, who calls himself a bit of a Tony Blair man. Yes, the same Tony Blair who supported the invasion of Afghanistan. Figes was also found to be plagiarizing other writers, making many basic factual mistakes, and later left anonymous bad reviews on the books of various authors that criticized him, as well as leaving anonymous good reviews for his own books before being caught. Or what about the rabidly anti-communist David Remnick, who helped manufacture consent for the Iraq War by uncritically parroting claims from Donald Rumsfeld that Saddam was connected to Al-Qaeda? Or how about Ronald Grigor Sunny, perhaps not a bad historian per se, but who, in an interview with the SRB podcast, now known as the Eurasian Knot, called Biden, who ravenously supported the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, as well as the apartheid state of Israel, a moral beacon? Or Sheila Fitzpatrick, a widely respected and influential historian, who also, in an interview with the SRB podcast, has openly said she thinks revolutions are pathological for wanting radical change without considering the human cost. So among some of the most influential historians of the USSR, we've got a Blairite, a Zionist, a Bidenist, many right-wingers and Reaganites, and a whole bunch of liberals. These are the historians most influential in shaping historical narratives that so-called socialists trust. Not to mention that plenty of these anti-USSR historians, like Applebaum and Montefiore, don't have PhDs in Russian history either, yet they never get nearly the same amount of attacks for it like Grover Furr does, and in fact, they are two of the most popular anti-USSR historians of the 21st century still writing. Some of these people, of course, like Sunni and Fitzpatrick, are capable of good historical work. And yes, there are socialist anti-Soviet historians, Trotskyists specifically, but none of these have really any more serious influence on modern discourse relating to the USSR than the likes of Grover Furr do. There is, of course, a good reason Trotskyist histories of the Soviet Union are not very popular. People aren't reading these books just to learn about how Stalin or the Soviet Union broadly was bad. They're reading it to learn about how communism is bad as a whole. It's thus rather ironic that Noam Chomsky, someone who famously said the USSR's collapse was a good thing, writes about the idea of manufacturing consent when that's what has been done with the USSR for 100 years. The consensus, so-called, ranges from the MSNBC in Simon Montefiore to the Fox News in Anne Applebaum. About 18% of academia in the social sciences identifies as Marxist, which is more than any other academic field, but still not much in the grand scheme. After all, 82% of all academics in the most Marxist field do not identify as socialist. So, the field of history isn't totally overrun by Marxists like people seem to think. In fact, as far as my research into the personal beliefs of popular historians of the USSR has found, none of the current popular influential historians of the USSR considers themselves a Marxist, unless you include Grover Furr. Again, there are a few Trotskyist historians out there still today, but none of them are widely read or influential in public discourse or understandings of the USSR. The closest to somewhat popular Marxist historians of the USSR, like Moshe Lewin or Isaac Deutscher, have both been dead for decades. Of course, there's a reason so many of these historians have connections to Western intelligence agencies and think tanks, after all. People seem to believe that academia is far more immune to capital than media is, but it's not all that true. Academia is highly susceptible to the political, economic, and sociological forces around it. Academia is an ivory tower, as they say, but there is also an ivory bridge from that tower to the banks and the parliaments and the mansions. This ivory bridge leads naturally to major conflicts of interest when it comes to Soviet study, with Western capital promoting, funding, and platforming research that portrays the USSR historically in a bad light, because in doing so they make capitalism look good in comparison. The USSR is synonymous with communism, so it's not surprising that capitalist universities are so filled with anti-USSR academics. The USSR is the ultimate boogeyman of anti-communist ideology. The USSR is the warning of what communism will bring, and as such serves a perfect propaganda purpose, and there is an extreme socio-economic incentive in maintaining this narrative, both for the individual historians' careers as well as for Western society as a whole.